I'm Scott.
I'm Bill.
And we're the Trade Guys.
You're listening to The Trade Guys, a podcast produced by CSIS where we talk about trade in terms that everyone can understand. I'm H. Andrew Schwartz, and I'm here with Scott Miller and Bill Reinsch, the CSIS Trade Guys. Coming up on the next episode of The Trade Guys, trade is, of course, back, and we're here to talk about some of the economic cabinet positions and potential positions. We'll also talk about Vietnam and China, all on the next episode of The Trade Guys. Trade Guys, we're back, and guess what? Trade is back. Big time, as we know, because why, Scott? We got Tariff Man coming back.
Tariff Man is the president-elect, yes.
We're always excited to talk about trade, but this makes it more exciting, undoubtedly, and I think even Bill would agree.
Yes, I would point out that we said the same thing last week, but apparently we're still excited.
Bill, listen. We're a trade podcast. Sometimes we say the same things over and over again.
We get accused of that from time to time. That's true.
Well, hey, you know that Scott and I can go into college and NFL football very easily.
Yes, let's avoid that. Let's get to the topics of the day.
But instead, we have a mega trend in trade policy being, once again, front and center.
And trade people.
And trade peoples. We like that.
That's a really good way to put it, Scott. It's a mega trend. It's absolutely a mega trend. You know, my good friend Mark Penn coined the term micro trend. This is a mega trend. And accordingly, let's talk about something that everybody's talking about. And these are, the economic positions that Trump is filling in the administration. Pretty wide praise for his Department of Commerce pick, Howard Lutnick, the chairman and CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald. What do you guys think? Scott, do you want to lead it off?
Well, I think, yes, that's the biggest pick so far. We're waiting to hear on Treasury Secretary and also USTR. Those two are vital to the trade portfolio. But Lutnick is an impressive figure. He has been a long-time trusted advisor of President-elect Trump. So it's not a surprise. He worked during the entire campaign, but he's been advising the president for a long time. Cantor Fitzgerald, it's a sleeper of a company. Because it's privately held, not many people know what it does. It's a financial services company, and it has this tragic event on 9/11.
Yeah, I was going to say most people know the name Cantor Fitzgerald and Howard Lutnick from 9/11. And Howard Lutnick, of course, narrowly missed being there himself on 9/11. He was taking his young daughter to her first day of school. And so, what a blessing that he survived. And my understanding is that he really took care of all the families that perished on that awful day.
Very much so. They occupied the top floors of the World Trade Center and had no escape. And several hundred, I believe 600 or so employees passed away that day in the tragedy. But the firm is really vital to the sort of the inner workings of Wall Street. Because they're private, they don't issue reports. We don't hear much about them. But they are a firm that's a real market maker. So what you have is a Commerce Secretary who has deep knowledge and experience in financial markets and understands investment flows, understands the role of investment in the U.S. economy. I think that's going to be a help. During the campaign, he was the good cop when it came to tariffs. President-elect would say something in a rally. He loves the word tariffs. And Howard Lutnick was talking to the Wall Street colleagues and saying, look, he's going to use it as a negotiating tactic. Don't lose your head over this. So I think there's a balance there. But importantly, what I see so far, now we're waiting for a Treasury Secretary nominee.
As you say, we're recording this at approximately 3:30 p.m. on Thursday, November 21st, the week before Thanksgiving. So if anything gets dated by the time this comes out, listeners, why we're talking about what we're talking about.
Yes, and I look back in 2016, 2017 transition, and Steve Mnuchin was also a late nominee. Many other positions were filled by then. It seems to be part of the pattern. But one of the things I've noticed is there's going to be a big push on making America investable again. If I look at Lutnick and then Doug Burgum, governor of North Dakota for Interior, and Chris Wright for Energy. Chris Wright is one of the most successful energy CEOs in the world and is a great advocate for natural gas. His company is massively successful in this space. Add in a Treasury Secretary like Senator Bill Hagerty of Tennessee or some of the other names that are out there.
Yeah, we're hearing Mark Rowan, also another investor.
Right. So what you'll have is a team on the economic side, if you include energy, which is very important to maintaining productivity and cost structures within industrial companies. So what you have is really people who are going to be ideal to focus on tax and regulatory reform in the early stages of the administration next year. So I think that's quite encouraging. It may push trade off for a little bit. We'll see. But overall, that's my take so far. There's still players to be named, so we'll wait for a fuller evaluation. Bill, what did I miss?
Bill's raring to go here, Scott.
Well, I don't know any of them personally, so I don't have anything to say about them in particular. I'd make a couple points. First, Lutnick's in for a surprise. About half the Commerce Department in terms of money and people is NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. And that means fish. And every Secretary of Commerce discovers early, particularly in the confirmation process, that if they don't know about fish, they're going to have problems. Because if you represent a coastal state in the Senate, you care about fish, you care about NOAA, it's just top of the list. Every secretary that comes in, for the most part, doesn't care about fish and has to learn about it reluctantly. But they do gravitate toward the things that Scott was talking about, in the sense that Commerce also has the National Institute of Science and Technology, NIST, and they do both trade promotion and export controls and import regulation with respect to anti-dumping and countervailing duty complaints.
You know what my favorite thing about this is, Scott?
Yes.
Bill is the former Undersecretary of Commerce, right?
Right.
And so he has a lot of experience to talk about this.
Yes, absolutely.
And, secretaries come in and they immediately gravitate toward trade and technology because that's cool. We keep telling everybody it's cool, but the secretaries think so too. I was just at a lunch where we were talking about the outgoing secretary, Gina Raimondo, who I guess did an interview with somebody. And really, I think she ended up sort of realizing that she was both the country's chief technology officer and the chief competition with China officer.
Mm-hmm.
And that's probably where the incoming secretary will focus. But, if he doesn't take care of fish, he's going to have problems with the Congress. The other piece of the story is sort of, what about Bob? One of the announcements about Lutnick was that Trump said he's going to oversee the U.S. trade representative and trade policy.
Right, which in the previous Trump administration, of course, was Bob, as in Bob Lighthizer.
Yes, and it's been pointed out that he said exactly the same thing about Wilbur Ross when he made him Secretary of Commerce in 2017. Then you saw what happened. Ross faded. Lighthizer took over and became basically the main thinker and spokesperson on trade for the entire Trump 1.0. We'll see if that happens again, but I'm a little surprised that he said it again. It was probably to make Lutnick think he was going to be important. We'll see. But it raises the question of, what about Bob? Does he want to be U.S. trade representative in a role that Trump has now said is diminished? Does he want to go to the White House in a role where Trump has already said Lutnick is going to be the main trade person? When the music stops, it's not clear there's a chair for him, which I think would be sad. I mean, I don't agree with him on a lot of things, but he's competent and he's got a boatload of integrity. He knows how to get things done. And most important for a Trump administration, he knows how to do them legally without cutting corners.
Bill, I worry about a lot of things, but I don't worry about Bob Lighthizer's skills as a negotiator. He's a terrific negotiator. He'll negotiate himself the job that he wants and thinks he can do well.
That's a good point, Scott.
So I feel no need to defend the guy. I think he'll be fine, whatever role he chooses. Yeah, and he'll be great at it.
Well, he's one of those people that you guys both know well. And he certainly was a bedrock of economic policy, trade policy in the last administration. Hard to imagine him not having some kind of a senior role. Seems to me maybe he's headed towards the White House.
I would think so. The rumor was he didn't particularly want to go back to USTR. I think he would probably be happier in a place where he could call the policy shots and advise the president directly and not have to deal with all the minutiae of actually being in charge of a cabinet level department and the travel. I don't think he was a big fan of all the travel. He didn't do very much, actually, but I think that's because he wasn't a fan. But that means they're going to have to find a role and title for him in the White House that fits. So we'll see. But I agree with you. I think it would be a big mistake for him not to be in the administration. I think Trump needs him. He was responsible for one Trump's really biggest trade success,
yes,
which was the U.S.-Canada-Mexico agreement, which was negotiated successfully. And I think Bob's larger contribution really was to get it through the Congress with probably the biggest bipartisan vote of any trade agreement that we've had. Nearly 200 votes on each party.
That's right.
The brilliant rebranding we affectionately know as, which Scott coined the term, USMACA.
Yeah, USMACA cured the politics of NAFTA. So good for Bob. That is an amazing achievement, as partisan as trade has been. I'm sure that he will be part of the administration in an important role, and I think it's probably good for trade and good for the administration.
All right. Speaking of trade, let's get into some issues. We're going to keep talking about, who's appointed Treasury Secretary, who serves in the White House, who's USTR. But we only know what we know so far, and we know that Howard Lutnick's the guy. So we'll leave it at that. Let's go on to another issue that I know is near and dear to y'all's hearts, which is currency manipulation. And the specific issue I'm talking about is Vietnam. What about this, guys?
Well, Vietnam is going to be in the target zone for Trump. Scott has pointed out on previous broadcasts, actually during the Trump administration, he focuses his attention on countries with which we have large bilateral deficits. So that means China, obviously, but it also means Japan, Korea, Mexico. He tried to include Germany and then discovered they were in the EU, and that made it a little bit more difficult. And as he was leaving office, he discovered Vietnam because that deficit was going up at the time and has since gone up even more dramatically since then. It is now over $100 billion annual trade deficit we have with Vietnam. It's the fourth largest, after China, the EU as a group, and Mexico. So it's huge. He probably is not going to be able to avoid it. The irony, of course, is that a significant part of it is his fault because it's a consequence of people de-risking from China, in part as a result of his tariffs. So you put tariffs on, as he did in 2018, and what do companies do? Quite naturally, they look for ways around them. And one way around it is to move. And the big winners were Vietnam and Mexico. And our trade deficits with both have ballooned. So you can expect Vietnam to be a target. He initiated an investigation into their currency practices late in his administration, which then didn't materialize by the time he left office, at which the Biden administration stopped. In the most recent report of the Treasury Department on who is manipulating their currency, there's this law that requires them to report twice a year on that. And they have a list of miscreants. And Vietnam did not make the list because you have to meet three criteria. You have to have a large bilateral deficit, which they have. So they check off that one. You have to have a large current account surplus, which they have, 5% of their GDP, I think. So check off that one. And you have to have a record of manipulating your currency, which the Treasury Department concluded they do not have. And so, unlike the Meatloaf song, 2 out of 3 ain't bad, in this case, 2 out of 3 is disqualifying. But they're being watched. And a new administration can reverse that decision in their next report, which will be probably in March or April. That's when they tend to come out, if they're assuming they're on time. So wait for that and see. The other thing to watch and see is that the Commerce Department under Biden, actually, I believe, probably started under Trump, has determined as a regulatory matter that currency manipulation or currency undervaluation, let me put it that way, could qualify as a subsidy under the countervailing duty law. And they have actually applied that now in 4 Vietnamese cases and assessed additional countervailing duties on Vietnamese products. And because of that, it's controversial in WTO world. It's actually controversial amongst lawyers in Washington because WTO rules and U.S. law says a subsidy has to be specific. That is, it needs to be provided to somebody, some specified entity, sector, industry, whatever. Currency undervaluation affects everybody. It's kind of the poster child for a non-specific subsidy. That didn't stop Commerce from deciding unilaterally that they were going to treat it as a countervailable subsidy. A little bit to my surprise, Vietnam has not complained to the WTO about that, which I think is kind of interesting because they have a good case. So it remains, unsettled as a matter of sort of international rules, but you can expect the Trump administration to monitor that situation more aggressively. So I would foresee more subsidy cases against Vietnam where currency undervaluation could very easily be used as a way of adding to other subsidies that are already there.
Well, we'll see if there's any time for reflection in the new Trump administration, because it looks to me like the tariffs that were applied by Tariff Man back in 2017, 2018, when this program started, are still all in place for the most part. The Biden administration continued the policy. Any negotiations to bring tariffs down again got stalled. So the tariffs now been in place and production has shifted and manufacturers have adapted and supply chains have changed. And as you point out, Bill, that leads to bigger trade surpluses in other countries as production moved out of China due to the tariffs. So we kind of got what we deserved in this respect. Whether that changes the policy going forward, we'll have to see. I'm somewhat skeptical, but at least there's something to be learned from this.
Well, one thing you can be sure of is Trump is not going to say it was my fault.
Yeah, I just oops. Oops. Let's not do any more of that. No, that's not going to happen.
Guys, we're talking about Vietnam, but we always got to talk about China. So let's talk about China. President-elect Trump's proposed tariff of at least 60% on Chinese goods could, as you said, Bill, boost Southeast Asian manufacturing in the short term. Chinese manufacturers might move their production to countries like Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, where they could avoid these direct tariffs by shipping U.S. products from there. What about this strategy?
Well, I think you're right about that. I think the Southeast Asian countries have had their eye on this kind of thing for a long time because they're the obvious beneficiaries if people decide to move out of China to avoid the tariffs, or even if they don't move out to create a redundant capability somewhere else, which is a lot of what we see is happening, which we've discussed before. And one of the interesting things is I think CSIS research suggested that Chinese companies are doing the same thing. It's not just Western companies because they have the tariff problem too. And so they're looking for other locations. And for Chinese companies, being Asian companies, the obvious place to go is Southeast Asia. So Vietnam has been the big winner so far, but you've got the other countries, Malaysia, Thailand, Cambodia, which has a very close political relationship with China, Indonesia, Philippines, all trying to snag a piece of Chinese supply chains and American supply chains. So that piece is going to grow, I think, and it's the same thing will happen that happened with Vietnam. It's not going to change significantly the U.S. overall global trade deficit. It's going to rearrange it. And the deficit with China will get smaller, but the deficit with these other countries will get bigger. So collectively, from the standpoint of our global trade balance, it'll end up being kind of a wash. I mean, that was one of the ironies of what Trump did. The deficit with China actually got bigger on his watch, and as did the deficits of some of these other countries. The other thing to look for, which I've been thinking a lot about lately, is what is the Chinese government going to do? And also, what are the Americans going to do? My column this week is on what are the Americans going to do to get ready? And there we're seeing stockpiling, people making advanced purchases to save up and have inventory so they don't get hit immediately. We're seeing people holding onto their wallets and delaying new investments because they're not sure what's going to happen. And we're starting now to see companies talking about price increases. Not doing them, but getting ready to do them and figuring out when, on what products, if not all of them, and how much. So that's where the Americans are going. Where the Chinese seem to be going are first a couple shots across the bow to remind us that they are basically in control of a lot of global supply chains. So they've imposed export controls on some critical minerals, gallium, germanium, most recently graphite. That was a few months ago. The other two were last year. Just last week, this is convoluted, they announced an end to their export tax rebates on aluminum and 3 or 4 other commodity products, which will have the effect of increasing the price of their exports, which will affect inflation here and affect availability here. And it's just, little nudges that are reminders that in an economically, globally integrated world, they have a lot to say about these things. There's a widespread expectation that they will retaliate. They always retaliate if we impose tariffs. And it's a growing expectation that the hardest part of the retaliation won't be in tariffs, it'll be elsewhere. So look for agriculture exports to be cut even further. That's an easy one that they usually resort to, particularly because there are other sources of supply. So they don't really cut themselves off. They'll just buy more soybeans from Brazil. And we've lost a substantial part of our market share already to that, and we're going to lose some more. So there will be that. There will probably be more minerals with export controls. The most interesting one, which is a macro one, is the expectation that they'll let the RMB continue to depreciate. And it's been going down anyway. It's now about 7.29, I think, to the dollar. It had been down into the sixes a year or so ago, and they could let it continue to go down. They don't even have to do anything. They just have to let that happen. That will mitigate the adverse effects of all the tariffs because it'll make their products commensurately cheaper. It also will make our exports more expensive. So not good for us. And it would be a reminder that, when you're a very big economic power like that, you can throw your weight around and have an impact.
Well, first of all, Bill's right about the hedging that's going on by firms who have part of their productions in China. Everybody's trying to make sure you have stock on hand, make sure you're not surprised. At the same time, there are 3 things that I think have been consistent over the years. They were true in the first Trump administration. They've been true all along. The first thing is that, and I think even China hawks would agree on this, it's very difficult to find a measure that actually influences policy in China. They're very difficult to budge on any issue. If they decide they're doing something, they're doing it. It almost doesn't matter what you do in terms of taking sanctions or tariffs or any other kind of measures. The second thing is China always is formulating countermeasures to actions against them. And it's not always direct, but it's always well thought through. And the third is all they have is export-led growth. It's very interesting because there are some economic headwinds for China. And we talked before on its lack of a domestic consumption base as part of the problem that they're struggling with. But export-led growth is their story. That's what they have. That's what they were talking about in APEC meetings last week, those kinds of things. So those are the three things that, to my mind, still characterize China's role in the world economy. And that's not different. And I don't think it's going to change anytime in the near future.
There may be one positive element. They rolled out a kind of a stimulus package 2 weeks ago that has been generally panned as insufficient. The biggest piece of it was basically debt swaps, which will help local governments eliminate their debt, but help them clear the debt off their books and consolidate it and give them an interest rate break on repayment. But the hint that came out of China was they were saving the bigger stuff for later, depending upon what Trump does, which I think is actually sort of sound reasoning, although I think people that are economists in China would say the economy is not in good shape. They ought to do more sooner rather than wait till later. But the consequence of what they could do is stimulate domestic demand. And, the West has been telling them that for
30 years. Yeah.
That you need to do that. Their standard solution to every economic crisis they have is to try to export their way out of it. And that's exactly what they're doing this time. And then we get overcapacity and you get all these people yelling at them. The right answer in economic terms is stimulate domestic demand to soak up the excess production that they're creating. They've been reluctant to do that. And if the tariffs force them to do that, which I think is questionable, but if that happens, that actually would be a good thing. It would be good for their economy, and it would also be good for the global economy. So we'll wait and see about how big a second stimulus package they come up with.
All right, guys, that about does it. We will be back to talk trade next week because trade is back and trade is big, as I mentioned before, and there's no bigger than the trade guys. So thanks, guys. This was great.
But we won't be back next week because next week is Thanksgiving.
Correct. We will be back in 2 weeks.
Yes. So holiday, everybody. You don't have to listen to us next week, but
you might have to listen to your families. I wish everyone a happy and healthy Thanksgiving. It is one of the greatest of American holidays, and we all have a lot to be thankful for.
Same here.
That's for sure. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
To our listeners, if you have a question for the Trade Guys, write us at tradeguys@csis.org. That's tradeguys@csis.org. We'll read some of your emails and have the Trade Guys react to it. You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast.